So again, welcome to the Oregon Central Coast Forest Collaborative Habitat Connectivity Science panel. We're really excited to be able to work with our speakers today who have put together some really great presentations related to the topic of habitat connectivity. So today we're going to hear from Matt Betts with Oregon State University, Ray Davis with the U.S. Forest Service, and DeDe Olson with the U.S. Forest Service. And they're going to be talking about habitat connectivity, especially as it relates to the Siuslaw National Forest, which is the national forest that the Oregon Central Coast Forest Collaborative works with. So we're going to have these three presentations of about 25 minutes each, and then have a big Q&A session following all the presentations at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the chat if you want to not lose track of them. But we will be covering all of those at the end. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with our presentations, starting off with Matt Betts.
Danny, how's that? Can you see it?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. So yeah, thanks very much to Danny for organizing the symposium, and thanks to all of you for attending. I'm doing my best to give you an overview of theory and concepts and connectivity, and then DeDe and Ray will get to the really interesting stuff, which has to do with how particular species might be responding to connectivity in the landscape. And I look forward to hearing all of your questions afterwards. So very much hoping I haven't kind of underestimated or overestimated what you know about connectivity. If anyone has questions, just hold them and I'll try and address them at the end. So the context for thinking about connectivity, obviously, is especially in forests, is that in recent decades and then historically, we've seen massive changes in forest cover across the planet, and this in turn has also fragmented forest. And many argue, and many have found that this has negative effects on biodiversity. And a number of years ago, we made some projections for what the effects of current forest loss rates and future forest loss rates would be on species endangerment under the IUCN. And not that any of you need bad news right now, but the answer is it's not very good. So a lot of us have spent time thinking about how can we reduce the impact of forest loss by configuring landscapes in a way that facilitates maintaining diversity. So what I'm going to talk about today is some basic theory. As I said, why do we even care about connectivity at all? It relates to dispersal. What are the differences between functional and structural connectivity? How we might measure connectivity. I'll get into something we term the matrix that probably many of you are familiar with, not the movie. Corridors and how they differ from the concept of connectivity, and then some evidence for the effectiveness of corridors. It'll be a bit of a whirlwind, but again, feel free to hold your questions and I'll try and answer them. So dispersal, a lot of you probably know, is the movement from one breeding location to another. It's a bit confusing because some people, metapopulation people, call this migration, but really we generally think about migration as broad scale movements back and forth between breeding grounds and wintering grounds, especially if you're a bird person. Dispersal really has more to do with, I'll call it the permanent movement from where you're born to where you breed, or from one breeding location to the following year's breeding location. So natal dispersal is just moving from where you were born to where you breed, and breeding dispersal is moving between two successive breeding areas. And generally, that's because you weren't happy with the first place you bred. Maybe your nest didn't succeed, or your litter failed, and you're looking for somewhere new to go. Or the conditions have changed on that site, causing decreases in habitat quality. So why do animals disperse? Again, I think I'm probably telling you things you already know, but at the individual level, it's less likely you'll find and breed with a relative. It means you're not going to be competing with your parents or your mates or other individuals of the same species for habitat density dependence, we call it. And also, it's a chance to upgrade your habitat quality. And you can upgrade your mate as well by dispersing, doing breeding dispersal. And then we all know that there are population level benefits to dispersal. It reduces inbreeding depression at population level, which can result in deleterious alleles. It enables species to respond to changing environments like climate change, maybe move northwards or upslope, as we've seen in recent decades. And it can result in metapopulation stability that I'll talk about in a little bit via something called the rescue effect. I like this little example here. This is a friend of mine from during my postdoc, did a model where he allowed species just to pick a species to pick their habitat at random versus basically picking the best habitat first. So they have knowledge, ideal knowledge of where the best habitat is. And at the population level, this has a massive effect on population growth rates. So this shouldn't be surprising. If animals know where to go to maximize their fitness, overall population will do really well. But this emphasizes the importance of dispersal and connectivity because it shows if an animal can move to the best place to breed, the overall population will do well. So dispersal for most animals and plants follows what we call this negative exponential distribution, a dispersal kernel we call this, and really it's just a nonlinear function of distance, how many individuals or the proportion of individuals, that's m on the y-axis, versus distance, in this case, kilometers. And this was a population model we did for flying squirrel, my gosh, probably 2 decades ago now. So, how sensitive a population model is to dispersal, these models are quite sensitive. And so little assumptions about how far an animal can move can affect population viability quite substantially. And how far animals can move is affected by connectivity. So another important concept then is the process of habitat loss and fragmentation. And you can see fragmentation is kind of the other side of the coin to connectivity. If a landscape is fragmented, we think about it not being connected well. But the problem is this process you can see here from 1 to 3 is that habitat loss often occurs concurrently with fragmentation. So for people like me that do science on how best to configure landscapes, it can be pretty tricky because you don't really know, unless you go out of your way to test it, the independent effects of how the landscape is fragmented or connected versus the effect of habitat loss. So that's, in this case, losing the black. Do you see? So what we have to do is to try and design experiments that deliberately tease apart habitat amount, that's on the y-axis here, from habitat fragmentation. In this case, it's measured as fractal dimension. So for example, here at the bottom, you've got 20% habitat with really high fragmentation. And then on the far right, 20% habitat with very low fragmentation. And an interesting question for conservation biologists and forest managers is, does this matter? Is it just the amount of habitat that matters, or is it how it's configured that really matters? And I'll talk about this a little bit more further on. You'd be surprised at some of the data coming out on this question. So similarly, top 95% habitat, you can see quite a difference between high fragmentation on the left and low fragmentation on the right. So why is dispersal and connectivity important? Well, as population ecologists, we have a bunch of models for how we think dispersal may or may not link populations. And so some of these you might have heard about before. On the y-axis in this conceptual model is how connected populations are. And on the y-axis is how big patches are. And you probably have seen this contrast before. I'll start with the top left. This is more like what we might see in a forest landscape that's only just started to be managed, that might be dissected by roads. Movement generally is pretty facilitated. And then if connectivity is still really high and there's a lot of movement among patches, we think about this as a panmictic population. And really it's functioning all as a single population. They're synchronously, demographic rates are synchronous and animals are moving back and forth just fine. And then metapopulation, very briefly, is a population of populations. So each one of these patches here is functioning somewhat independently in terms of birth rates and death rates, And movement helps facilitate recolonization of patches that happen to go locally extinct. So dispersal particularly important in metapopulations. And then moving back down to highly isolated, non-equilibrium landscapes are patches that are performing entirely independently, and there's none of this rescue effect. There's no connectivity between these patches, and that can result in local extinctions that don't get recolonized at a later time. Okay. So we've done some playing around with models, and so Ray's going to be rolling his eyes at the moment because these models were parameterized with kind of not fantastic data. This is more for the course I teach in landscape ecology. And for my students, I get them to play around with patches. You can see on the north in the right-hand side of your figure, you've got patches of spotted owls, and then they can be linked by connectivity, these dispersal kernels. And we find, to summarize, these connected populations behave very differently to one in which dispersal is shorter. And the reason for that is the process I just finished telling you about, which is the rescue effect. These little patches that aren't connected tend to have populations that go locally extinct, maybe even just due to random processes, and then they don't get recolonized. So dispersal and then how connected these populations are can have very strong effects in metapopulations. And theory says that, and also empirical evidence shows that. So at this point, I should probably get around to defining connectivity. And this is a classic paper, actually, by a guy who's on my committee, Phil Taylor. And he said the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes movement among resource patches is connectivity. And then Kim With followed up with connectivity being a functional relationship among patches owing to how they're configured and how animals move. And so there are a couple of things you should notice about these definitions. Both of them require information about specific species. Often people think about connectivity just in general, or similar to the way they think about habitat, like is it good habitat or bad habitat? But the answer is, of course, it depends on the species. So I like these two definitions because they relate to this term called functional connectivity. And so this is the idea that how connected a landscape is really depends not just on the configuration of the patches, whether there are corridors, etc., but actually on how the animal behaves. So, for example, this red-backed vole might consider this area that I've highlighted in yellow as connected because it's a late cereal species and doesn't like to move across agricultural areas. But on the other hand, you might have a peromyscus or a field mouse that actually finds the forest to be a barrier and it prefers to move through fields. So in contrast, then, a lot of people think about connectivity in terms of structural connectivity, which is more the way we humans define the landscape. Just drawing a box around this forest here and saying, yeah, that's all connected. We can see that it's connected by forest, but it's agnostic to how species are actually responding to these landscapes. So hopefully that makes sense. A couple of interesting, I'm a behavioral ecologist, really, and that's how I started out. So I got interested for a while in what affects functional connectivity that isn't just the landscape. And so you can imagine things like mortality risk. An animal might have no trouble moving from patch A to B, but if there is a red-tailed hawk in the neighborhood, they won't because of the mortality risk. How agile the animal species is, how they can move around affects connectivity, obviously. And then also little bits and pieces like how far the animal can see. I'm perpetually amazed by Ruskin newts that can somehow cross, many, many kilometers in search of a breeding pond, but seem to be only able to see very short distances with short search capacities. So it's an open question how some of these species that can't see very far know where to go and get around. And motivation can matter too. I'll talk about that in a second. So one of the problems with studying connectivity is you can't just put a radio transmitter on something, watch it move around, and if it doesn't cross a road, for example, in this classic chicken case, assume that it's not able to cross a road. It could well be that there's just no motivation to cross the road. Maybe those peas on the other side aren't sufficiently good, or the animal just doesn't really feel like moving that day. So one tool that people have used, including myself, is something called a translocation experiment. And we've done this now for flying squirrels, and hummingbirds in Costa Rica. So I'm going to give you a little research break here and talk about some of my own work for the next 2 minutes or so. So what we did in this study was we captured hummingbirds. On the right-hand side, you can see a rufous-tailed hummingbird in Central America. Then we did something a bit mean, which was to carry the hummingbird across open country, in this case pasture, and then test to see what their movement patterns were coming back, and then if it even came back at all to their original territory. So we translocated 9 birds across agricultural mosaics and then 10 across contiguous forest at distances that were pretty far, 300 meters to 1,500. And then we measured how long it took them to get back and then the movement path they made. And so at the time, we were some of the first people to put transmitters on hummingbirds, but more people are doing that now. It's a green hermit hummingbird with a 0.18 gram. Oh, well, back then it was 0.25 gram transmitter on them. And these are the sorts of data we get back that test this idea of connectivity. So green is forest, orange is pasture, the yellow is the movement route. These birds took 2 birds that were translocated from the green squares to the blue triangles. And you can see they're really faithful to forest and therefore respond quite well even to what we would term structural connectivity. Their functional connectivity matches the forest as we can map it on the landscape. Yeah, I'm going to skip this. So how have people measured connectivity in the past? Well, it's not been entirely satisfactory in my opinion, but the most simple way to do this is to look at how close patches are in the landscape with a measure like mean nearest neighbor, just calculating the distance between all patches in a particular area. Some people have just drawn circles around points in the landscape and asked how much forest or how much habitat there is within that area. Then you end up with some nicer functional connectivity models that look like this, that basically quantify the permeability or the probability of an animal moving from one step to another and quantify functional connectivity from a species perspective. And the reason I don't love those measures I just showed you, the mathy ones, is that, there's this challenge in real landscapes where we have different sorts of matrix. And the matrix is just defined as the area between patches of interest. You can see it as patches of forest, or you could see it as patches of habitat. And so in this case, is the probability of movement of, say, X species more likely or less likely across this agricultural field versus moving through a clear cut versus moving through younger tree plantation. So all these are different sorts of matrix. And we've learned through some of our work, especially on flying squirrels, that matrix really matters. You can see big differences in how different species respond to these intervening areas, the matrix. And just as a cartoon to hammer that home, you have 2 landscapes, A and B, and they've got identical forest configurations with the same species in them, this butterfly, and matrix can make all the difference between whether or not these patches in A out here, these fragmented ones, get colonized, and whether they don't, right? So Lenore Fairig, who's at Carleton in Ottawa, has done quite a few models playing around with various matrix permeabilities and spatial models of population dynamics. And again, she's found the matrix matters. I'm going to skip this, but this is just a paper that's classic now showing that islands, patches of similar size in water behave very different to patches of similar size on forest landscapes. And connectivity matters much less, at least structural connectivity in forest landscapes, because these birds can move in between them quite easily, whereas the island fragments behaved a lot more like true fragments and behaving independently of each other. So what sorts of animals might need connectivity, particularly need connectivity? I would argue that it's species associated with landscapes that have historically been very connected. So the extreme example of maybe a species not needing as much connectivity is one that's evolved in the context of high patchiness and is very habitat specific. So it's become very useful to moving long distances between necessary patches. So you might think about potentially an early seral species on the east coast of North America where disturbance was relatively low, think eastern deciduous forest, it would be very maladaptive to require high connectivity and meadow if the landscape is dominated by forest and disturbance doesn't happen very much. On the flip side, if you're a species whose skin dries out very rapidly, maybe because you breathe through it, and you need cool, moist conditions, connectivity a forest could become very important. Lady slipper as well. If you're dispersed by a tiny ant that doesn't like to cross open areas, you're going to require higher connectivity. And then also species that typically, as part of their evolutionary strategy, move around a lot. It's counterintuitive to think that species that move a lot might need connectivity, but this is true. We can discuss later. So just a few more notes on fragmentation and connectivity. I don't want you to walk away from this presentation thinking that conservation biologists completely agree on the matter, because it's been somewhat frustrating that we've been mired in a debate for decades about whether or not fragmentation and connectivity really matter. And this is a paper that came out, I think, in 2018, led by Lenore Farrigan Lab, asking, does fragmentation really have bad effects on biodiversity? Um, and she made the argument that actually what we define as fragmentation, which is how big the average patch size is, might actually, bear with me here and see if you can follow this logic, increase the connectivity of a landscape. Okay, so just for a minute, you've got panel C, which has 3 patches in it and the same amount of habitat in the green as D. Okay, because this patch is so big, it necessarily is on average further away from these 2 small patches. So she would argue that even though, this is a less fragmented landscape, it's just one big patch with 2 little ones, it could have lower connectivity than this landscape over here, which has a lot of patches in it and they're close together. So hopefully you're guessing how I'm going to respond to this, but I'm going to keep going for a sec. So then the response was by Rob Fletcher and others saying, well, actually, fragmentation is pretty bad. We know for our models, and there are a bunch of empirical research showing that fragmentation has negative effects. Our, typical Canadian here, our response was, really, people, we need to try and get along here. Let's think about connectivity and fragmentation from the view of particular species. It's going to vary massively. And the only way we can really think about connectivity properly is to model habitat. And you're seeing habitat distributions for these 2 different species of warblers, highly related. But you can see that the distribution of their patches is really different. And so no single approach can measure connectivity effectively. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. So just a brief word on corridors, and I'm going to start wrapping things up. What are corridors? Really, they're actual physical, think of the structural connectivity definition, strips of land that connect habitat, or strips of a cover type like forest that are designed to limit the effects of habitat loss and fragmentation and to facilitate movement between patches. So the classic example might be something like the highway overpasses in Banff that they've built to facilitate crossing by grizzlies. And there has been some very nice experimental work showing that corridors can have beneficial effects. So this was a study done in Georgia by Josh Tewksbury and others that actually got cooperated with the Forest Service to do these giant corridor experiments. And so their design was cool in that it had 2 patches, looks like a barbell with a corridor in between them. And then they also had patches with wings on them to mimic maybe the drift fence effect of corridors, but not connected to other patches. And then they had some patches that were just bigger, testing whether it might not be the corridor per se, just the size of a patch. And then they looked at pollination success, that's fruits per flower and seeds per patch, and the movement of pollen dye. They've since looked at butterfly movement. They've looked at a whole suite of ecosystem services that seems to be facilitated by these corridors. Keep in mind, the matrix in this case is mature forest, and the corridors are early seral forest, and the patches as well. Some have argued that we really need connectivity to facilitate broad-scale continental level movements by species in the face of climate change. So the configuration on the right here is going to be much more effective than the configuration on the left. And agencies, or not agencies, NGOs like Nature Conservancy are actually writing some of these ideas about broad scale connectivity into their plans for acquiring land. But corridors have not always been seen as being fantastic. And there are a number of instances in which increasing connectivity can also increase disease spread, can increase the flow of invasive species, it can increase competitors with a species. So I also don't want you to walk away from this presentation thinking that connectivity is always good and that corridors always fulfill an important role there. And there's some risk of spreading fire through corridors. Predator-prey interactions could change. And then, of course, corridors are inherently edgy. So if you have negative effects of edge on species, that's not ideal. And humans have easier access to forest, in particular through corridors, because often they're close to places humans can access. So I'm going to skip this one and then conclude just by saying that we did do a global analysis of the effects of fragmentation on species. And for this, we had 60 odd data sets from all around the planet with thousands of species. And we asked whether or not the strength of fragmentation effects change with latitude. And so on the y-axis on this left figure, you can see the proportion of species that like to be away from the forest edge and typically like landscapes that are connected with forest. And on the x-axis is latitude. And you can see the number of species that really don't like fragmentation decreases across latitude. So up where we are here, you're going to find a smaller proportion of species that care how a landscape is configured. And really the better thing to do is to focus on how much habitat you have. That doesn't mean that there aren't species that aren't fragmentation sensitive. It just means there are fewer than in the tropics. Okay, so to summarize then, dispersal is often fundamental for population viability, especially in patchy populations like metapopulation. Connectivity influences dispersal. Connectivity is very species specific and is influenced by how a species perceives the matrix. Corridors can help connectivity, but they can also cause a bunch of problems. And then finally, you can't, unfortunately, I sound like a classic researcher who's just looking for more business, but you really need to find out whether or not fragmentation affects your species of interest in the geographic area where you are. It's highly unlikely we're going to come up with a universal rule for how connected a landscape needs to be for all species. So I'll end with that, and hopefully I didn't go too far over. And I don't know who's next. Is it DeDe or is it Ray?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. And we're going to pass it over to Ray.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the good overview. A lot of interesting stuff. I think I'm going to use some of your slides for some work I'm doing, so if you don't mind. All right, let me see if I can share my screen. All right. Are folks seeing my screen, my first slide?
We're seeing it in the PowerPoint form.
Okay. How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Cool. Yeah, so very interesting stuff. Matt, thanks for going over that, providing the big picture overview. Thank you, Danny, for setting this up. Hello, everybody. Thank you for your interest tuning in today. My name is Ray Davis. I work for the Northwest Forest Plan Interagency Monitoring Program. And so I'm going to be presenting more local information and tapping into a fair amount of the information that comes from this monitoring program. I oversee monitoring of northern spotted owl populations and habitat. And also, we used to call them late successional and old growth forests, but now we're calling them mature and old growth forests. So based on the questions that I saw, I'm going to talk a little bit about forest fragmentation in terms of historic conditions and what's led to current conditions. I'm going to touch on habitat connectivity because I focus on northern spotted owls and retrievals mostly. I'm going to be focusing on the older forest types, talk a little bit about edges and microclimate, and then I'll close with some climate change. pictures. So here we are. You should be seeing a slide with the Sayusla National Forest. I actually started my career here back in 1989. I was a district wildlife biologist on this forest for a few years before I moved over to the Umpqua National Forest. This slide will show you going back 120 years ago, 124 years ago. This is a hand-drawn map of what they call burnt forest, mostly large patches of dead trees, high severity stand replacement fires. And as you can see, those look a lot like the boundary of the Sayusla National Forest. And it's the history of these fires that I think actually fed into the delineation of the forest reserve that eventually became the national forest. Now, this is a 1900 map. Here's a slightly fresher map from 1912. So you can already see that the burnt forest patches are starting to fill in, starting to recover. So, you know, Matt was talking about connectivity, and depends on the species. So there's not one size fits all. What I'll say about the subject is it's always changing. Forests are always dynamic. The frequency of change sometimes is fast, sometimes it's slow with abrupt changes, but they're always changing. This is what it looked like in 1936. And so the burnt areas have faded more or less by this time. There was a new fire up in the Tillamook area. That's the Tillamook burn from 1933. And you can also see the first signs of large scale clear cutting, these brown patches here and here, mostly along the edges of the valleys, large populations, good timber mill infrastructure along the coast here. But these fire patches right here have now grown up enough to be small conifer and even large conifer. Some of these fires happened in the mid 1800s, and it's a very productive tree growing area. So some of these were small conifer seed sapling and starting to become large conifer. You can see most of the old growth back in this day was skirting around the Sayusla, and a lot of it was in the Cascades, Western Cascades, and a lot of it was really well connected in the Western Cascades, as opposed to the Coast Range, where you see big breaks in the connectivity for some of these forest types. So the monitoring, some of the monitoring that I do is, again, looking at mature and old growth forests. And so this is from our 25-year monitoring reports. We put those out in 2022. They covered the period from 1993 to 2017. So we actually go back a little bit further in time just to kind of see how things changed before the spotted owl was listed and the Northwest Forest Plan was designed and implemented. This is a map of what we call Old Growth Structure Index, OGSI, and we use index that represents 80 or plus older trees, forest stands. And so the dark green in this map is our best effort to map mature and old growth forests, and we're using Landsat satellite data, Landsat satellite data going back to 1986. So this next slide will show you a quarter century of change. So it went from this to this in 25 years. I'll go back and forth a little bit, and I'll point you to some areas. Well, focused on the Sayusla, you can see there's a lot more green in 2017, a lot more mature and old growth forest. The other thing that pops out to me is in the space between the Sayusla National Forest and the Umpqua and Willamette National Forest down here in the southwest corner, you can see the contrast between, between the non-federal and the federal land much better in 2017. So you can see the edges of the ownership here in the Cascades. You can see the 1 square mile BLM checkerboard starting to pop out in between the Sayusla and the forest in the Cascades. So now I'm going to zoom in tighter to an area because some interesting things happening here. We have 2 wilderness areas, Commons Creek and Rock Creek. And then north of that, there's this old clear cut right here. We call that the Blodgett clear cut. That happened in the 1930s. In fact, I think you can see it here in this old map. So let's focus in now and look at this at a tighter scale. We're looking at just the binary map. Is it mature and old growth forest or not? So if it's green, it's mature and old growth forest, and this is 1986. And then in addition to the amount, as Matt was describing, sometimes the pattern really matters. And so we're actually required to track not only the amount of these forests, but the spatial arrangement of these forests. And the way we do that is we turn this binary map into this 4-part map. And so the colors here represent interior. And so these are the greater than 30 meters, 1 satellite, Landsat satellite pixel width. There's actually some literature that indicates that you can get a lot of microclimate recovery within these types of forests within 30 meters of a hard edge. And so, or, old growth, mature old growth, and a clear cut, something that's very high contrast edge. And so, but anyway, this is how we define it. So we have our interior portions, and then we have edges around those, and those combined make patches. So the smallest patch you will see in this map is roughly a 2-acre size patch. Connecting these patches or extending from a patch are these orange pixels. So we call these fingers. So they have to be touching a patch, and they can either connect 2 or more patches, or they can just extend from a patch and fade out. These would be places that I would associate connectivity for the types of animals and the plants that rely on mature and old growth forests. And then the scatter category, this is Landsat information. It's susceptible to noise and atmospheric conditions and shadows. And so a lot of the scatter, you can hardly see them on this map, but they're little gray pixels scattered around. A lot of that's actually not real, but we quantify it anyway. Some of it is, some of it's not. But anyway, it's places that are just too small to have an interior, and they're not connected to anything else other than another scatter pixel. All right, so this is, I'm going to step ahead 10 years. So this is 1986. Now we jump ahead to 1996. If you look to the east of these wilderness areas where I have my cursor, hopefully you can see my cursor moving around. You'll notice that there's some clear cuts popping up. This was the end of the era when federal forest did a lot of clear cutting. Spotted owl was listed, and we transitioned from clear cutting to more of a thinning type of regime. And so, but you also notice that the wilderness areas are starting to form patches, and from those patches, there's extensions or fingers. Now I'm going to jump ahead to 2026, and things are starting to fill in now, even more in these 2 wilderness areas. You're starting to see a signature of small patches coming in that 1930 clear cut. And you're no longer seeing staggered clear cuts here in the Saisla. You're starting to see some of these plantations from those old clear cuts starting to grow up and form scatter and fingers and connecting to the adjacent patches. All right, now this is the last picture, and this is 2016. And so now there's been enough time for the forest to grow here in that Blodgett timber cell tract that you're starting to see the patches start to form. Lots of scatter and fingers are starting to come together to form those patches, and the wilderness areas are now almost fully connected with interior. All right, so that's how we track this information. You can get online. There's a link. I sent this to Danny, so hopefully she can share it with you folks. There's a link that you can click on that'll open up an application online that you can explore these maps yourselves. All right, now I'm switching over to spotted owls. And so here's how we track dispersal for spotted owls within the Northwest Forest Plan area. So now we're going back, bigger picture, this area, this big area on the left, this is the range of the northern spotted owl, also known as the Northwest Forest Plan area. And I'm focusing here on this circle, which is got a radius of 15.5 miles, which is roughly big enough piece of the landscape that spotted owls can usually move through if there's enough nesting, roosting, and dispersal forest cover type within it. So in 1986, there was a good connection between the Cascades and the Coast Range right here. And so now, jumping ahead 10 years, they actually filled in. The entire circle is now what we call dispersal capable, or it has greater than 40% of the circle with these types of forests, dispersal being greater than 11-inch DBH and 40% canopy cover, but they also mostly disperse through nesting and roosting forest cover types, the darker green on this map. So if you look at the circle, I'll go back in time, you can see some of these lighter shades of green are starting to turn dark. You're starting to see the checkerboard pattern of the federal BLM lands in between. And now I'm jumping ahead to 2006. We're starting to see this bridge between the Cascades and the coast starting to shrink again. And this is because I call this the echo of the clear cuts. There's a lot of clear cutting in mid 1900s in this area, or 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. On a 40-year rotation, this is about the period in time when they're doing a second rotation. So they're basically going back. The trees are big enough that they can market them. So they're doing another clear cut, a second rotation clear cut. And so you're starting to see that pattern here on non-federal lands. And then jumping ahead to 2016, now we see this bridge broken, not so much by what's going on the federal lands, but what's going on around those federal lands on the non-federal timberlands. And then jumping, that's the last one right there. So 2016. So that's sometime between 2006 and 2016. That's when this has disconnected. You also seen the effects of some large fires. So we got, this is the Biscuit Fire down here in southwestern Oregon. You can see that created a little hole in that part of the landscape. And in general, we've been getting lots of big fires, in particular the 2020 fires. And what we're observing is this landscape, the spotted owls can disperse through, starting to become more constricted to the federal lands. And there are some connections that are being broken. Okay, retrieval. So another late successional associated species. Here's a publication that came out in 2017 showing how its habitat in the northern portion of the Coast Range, where there's a distinct population segment for this species, has changed in the last 100 or so years. So it looked like this in 1911, it looked like this in 1936, and as of 2015, it's like this, very disconnected, highly fragmented. Back in 1911, still fragmented because these landscapes are just naturally that way, but pretty good connection from north to south. And there's a paper that came out, or a master's thesis by Chiseki in 2023, Oregon State University. I just did this sketch based on that to try to illustrate what he found in his research was the highest abundance of nests in this part of the retrievals range, around 300 nests per hectare in 200-year-old forests. If you get a disturbance that takes it down away, stand replacement, it goes down to 0. But if it's adjacent within 2 kilometers of a surviving patch at about age 20 in the Coast Range, you start to see some use of those forests. And that dwindles as those plantations or those burnt areas start to recover. But by 60, there's not a lot of use in those, but it starts to come back as they start to develop bigger crowns. So if you're thinking about the first map I showed you, they're starting to form fingers and patches and more structure. And so this is kind of a temporal sequence of how that might change through time. All right, so edge effects. That was one of the questions. This is a topic that's been around for a long time here in the Pacific Northwest. This is the Oregonian front. They had a special section in October 15th of 1990 on this. And back then, wind coming in from a hard edge, this would be a hard edge. Wind coming in from clear cut into the adjacent mature or old growth forests. Things drying up, et cetera, et cetera. Some newer science I find very compelling is associated with this term, the vegetation breeze. And this gets to thermodynamics. So what the scientists are finding, if you clear the vegetation, which is providing some shade from the sun and moisture microclimates within these older forests, the ground heats up, the air starts to rise, it starts to entrain the cooler moisture forest from the adjacent older forests and starts to dry those out that are adjacent to clear cuts. So this is something that, starting to get more focus, I think. But there's a paper, Colorado State University, Kikatuff, 2016, that describes the effect of these hard edges on surviving remaining older forests and how far those effects percolate into these surviving stems from those hard edges and how they affect animals that use this older forest, their activity time, and in terms of where they would like to be. So basically, they're using most of that area. And as the edge starts to come in, they're using less and less of it. All right. So there's all this stuff I just threw at you. And now I'm going to talk about the future. Because climate change is happening, and it's going to continue to happen. So this is some work I did recently for the National Maternal Growth Forest Threat Analysis. What we're looking at are two maps of historical temperature as number of days that exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and then moisture, climatic water deficit, where the blue areas in both maps represent on the left cooler, on the right moisture. If you're familiar with the Western Hemlock distribution, it really fits the blue shades of these maps really well, the historical maps of both of these things. So this is historical, recent, the last 3 decades of last century. Here's what the science predicts for the middle part of this century. So you can start to see more of the drier colors, more of the warmer colors starting to creep up and move in towards the coast range. And the cooler, moisture parts are starting to shrink towards the ocean shores. By the end of the century, it's predicted to look like this. So everything I just went over is going to be exposed to these climate effects, and how that's going to change connectivity, microclimates, et cetera, is something that I think we should be focusing on. I focused on it in terms of wildfires. So this is some work that we published in 2017 that takes climate, and we produced a map that that shows something about the normal. By normal, I mean what happens over the course of 3 decades, our climate normal frequency of large wildfires. So you can see the red areas, that's where the model predicts you're going to get most of your large wildfires. In the blue areas, they still burn, but they burn very infrequently. As you can see here in 2020, these are 4 of the big fires that happened here in that year. And they're right on the edge of the blues and the lighter tones on this map. So all these black outlines, these are fires that happened during this climate normal. You can see how they really fill in the red area. I call that the bullseye. This is fires since 2021, and the map for the climate normal that's going to end in 2040. So I'm going to jump ahead now to 2060. You're going to start to see the darker blues are starting to recede, and the oranges and the reds and the yellows are starting to move from the southwest to the northwest. By 2080, it's predicted to look like this. And then by the end of the century, you even have oranges and yellows here in the Coast Range. And so ponder what that might mean for fires in these long-term, historically moist, infrequent fire type forests. So there's some changes I think that are coming that we need to be aware of and thinking about. All right, now back to switching to spotted owls. The edges and climate change. I'm trying to tie those together here. So work with Damon Lesmeister from PNW Research Station, and we make maps of nesting roosting forest. And we also turn those maps into the spatial patterns I talked about. So here we're looking at, on the right, the interior portions of nesting roosting, older forests, and the edges of those forests, including the fingers in the scatter. We looked at 3 decades of fire severity in association with this map right here. And what we found was in the non-nesting, so the younger forests, the non-spotted owl nesting roosting forest types, there's a significantly increasing trend in high severity fires since I think that's 1987 there. I can't really see the numbers, and it's been a while since we did this, but you can see through time the proportion of the area burnt is becoming more severe through times. Now in the edges, it's still increasing, but not significantly, statistically significantly. And it's increasing at a slower lope as it does in the open areas. And that makes sense. Those, even they're fragmented, they're providing shade and some amount of protection from sun and the wind. And within the interior, that's where it's still slightly increasing, but not by a whole lot, at least during this time period. So this indicates that there might be some resistance. It's not immune, but some resistance in the interior forests that remain or are developing, as opposed to the other places that are open and not covered with trees, even in the scattered form. All right, so there's that happening. So we're trying to get ready for it. So now we're making these maps. These are hot off the press. Working with Rocky Mountain Research Station, we're calling these fire refugia maps. These aren't published yet. We're working on it. The blues here in this map and the greens represent places we call fire refugia, and those are places that burn less severely or less frequently than the surrounding landscape. You can see the Coast Range really pops out as a fire refugia here. Now by mid-century, it's going to look like this. So you're still in an area, but some of these places where you've had some of the bigger fires historically are starting to be less blue. Also, topography is starting to matter more. If you look here in the dry parts, and I zoom in, which I will do here, in this slide, this is what you see. This fire refugia are down in these lower slope positions, north aspects, and it just so happens that those coincide with our maps of northern spotted owl habitat. So there's this strong connection between where spotted owls nest and roost in and fire refugia, especially in the fire-prone portions of its range. And with the monitoring data, we're actually able to show that within these bluer areas, these fire refugia, through time, we've managed up to 2022 to maintain that closed canopy nesting roosting forest. We still have a positive balance. It's gone down. And where it's gone down most is outside of those fire refugia. And I think the reason it's gone down a little bit was because there's been some expansion from those fire refugia, these dark green areas. When we take fire out of the system, and we have for over a century, those areas start to expand. Trees start to develop in places where the fires would have kept them in a different variety of trees or more open. And then when they burn, they're adjacent to the good stuff, and they take some of the good stuff away with them. All right, so that's my last slide. I'm going to pass this over now to DeDe with just a little explanation of these maps right here. So the Northwest Forest Plan, we monitor a lot of things, but we also want to understand what's changing those things. So we produce other maps. So here's a map of terrestrial connectivity for species that don't have wings and can move moderate amounts of distances. DeDe is going to be talking about riparian connectivity here next in the triad concept. And there's also connectivity for the things in the water, so streams, and the connectivity of streams with our road systems and culverts is also important. So with that, I will hopefully answer your questions when we're done here, and I'll pass it over to DeDe.
Great. Thank you so much, Ray. And yes, we'll pass it over to DeDe.
Thank you. So let's see if I can get my sharing going here. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, well, thank you. I really thank the invitation to come and speak to you all today. And I loved Matt's presentation and Ray's, and I'll try to connect a bit with theirs as I'm connecting across landscapes with an eye to a different, a specific group of organisms, the amphibians. And I'll come back to this idea of funnels and chains a bit, because I really feel that how the landscape is occurring for amphibians, even before human disturbances is considered, funnels these animals along specific areas that are somewhat like corridors naturally. And connecting those funnels, those corridors as chains across landscapes is the root concept of connectivity for these animals. So let's go forward and see how I can build this story. Oh, okay, I hit forward, it didn't go. Let me try again. It doesn't seem to be going. I'm trying all the buttons. There, it went forward.
Yes.
I'm not sure what I did. I was hitting so many buttons at the same time. So for amphibians, and especially in the Coast Range, there's 15 native amphibians across the Oregon Coast Range, a few less just in the Central Oregon Coast Range. And these are familiar to many of you. I'm sure there's some that you have seen in or near streams, and that's a Dicamptodon, a Pacific giant salamander being shown there. There's another assemblage that is our pond breeders. You might hear the frogs chorusing in the springtime. The pond breeders are in and near ponds. But there's another assemblage of amphibians that only occur in the uplands. They do not need to go to standing or flowing water ever in their life, terrestrial amphibians. However, also in the riparian uplands are the adults of the pond breeders and the stream breeders. So you'll find all three of those basic assemblages in uplands. Just a sidebar, amphibians are important for many reasons, and two of the main reasons that I'd like just to point out here to keep in the back of your mind as we go forward is that amphibians are really central to forest food webs. They serve as both prey and predator to the system. They will eat anything they can get in their mouth, so they're gape limited, and they'll eat those smaller animals. And then they also are the prey of mammals, birds, and anything bigger than them. So they're really connecting the communities of these forests. And they, because they are in aquatic, riparian, and upland habitats, they are aiding in the energy or nutrient transfer between different ecosystems. They'll take aquatic subsidies and move them into the upland dry forest or drier forest areas. And they'll take those terrestrial subsidies and transfer them back to aquatic systems when the pond breeders lay their eggs and the larvae develop later in those waters. They also, as they're eating the prey, many of the prey that they are eating have roles in, for example, being leaf litter detritivores, breaking down leaf litter. And as insects do that, they release carbon to the atmosphere. As amphibians eat those bugs, then they are stopping that carbon going from the atmosphere. They're keeping that energy, that carbon in the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems on ground. So they have a role even in greenhouse gases and maybe climate change as well. So these are some of the ecosystem functions of amphibians and why we think they're important to keep. Where are amphibians in forests? So I think there's a basic understanding that there are aquatic ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems in forests. But as I've studied these animals over the last 40 years, it's more complicated than that. In 1994, when the Northwest Forest Plan was first initiated, there was a lack of understanding really of the diversity and the importance of amphibians in the landscape. And I was pointed to that as an information gap that needed filling. And I started working in stream systems and headwater streams. And so now, 40 years later, I think that there is really a lot of different ecosystems in forests. It's not just the trees, and it's not just the riparian areas. It's more complicated than that. So here is a schematic diagram of a headwater forest area. There are different species that occur in the uppermost portions of headwater streams, and you'll see intermittent streams pointed out there, with torrent salamanders being that white wedgie of that pie chart. They dominate these headwater ecosystems. If you go down into the slightly larger but yet still headwater streams where you have perennial flow, the giant salamanders are dominating those areas. So the perennial streams is shown by that, the species composition is shown by that next pie chart that has the largest wedgie being dark blue, and giant salamanders are those dark blue animals. So giants do occur in the uppermost headwaters, but they're a small wedgie. And torrent salamanders can go down into the perennial streams, but they're a tiny little wedgie down there. So these places are different by the species composition, but also the habitats that that are defined in those areas by water flow and other physical and biotic characteristics. Now, my headwater doesn't show ponds, but ponds are on these landscapes. They can be backwaters of streams that have no flow, or they can be wetlands that occur in that upland forest landscape. And there's another assemblage of pond breeding amphibians that occur there. I don't have examples here because they weren't part of my my headwater stream study, but pond breeders would be like the Pacific tree frogs, or the red-legged frogs, or the rough-skinned newts. And these are things that maybe you are more commonly seeing even in your backyards. They're not always specific to forest landscapes. They can be occurring more broadly. But in forest landscapes, we have the upland component. And here you see some plethodonid salamanders. They do not ever have to go to water for breeding. They occur and have habitat associations with downed wood or rocky substrates, talus in their substrate. Here, that assemblage is represented by just a few species in this diagram, but sometimes it's a much more robust assemblage. In addition, in the uplands are the terrestrial forms of the stream breeders and the pond breeders. So the stream and pond breeders, they breed in the water, but then they go terrestrial, so they can be in uplands. Lastly, I really call out the streamside or riparian area as distinct because there are semi-aquatic animals that occur there. And this Dunn's salamander is an example, and that's that sort of a tan color wedgie of the pie there. They have really high associations within 50 feet of the streams, even within 10 or 20 feet of the streams. You'll see Dunn salamanders, and there's other salamanders like that that are semi-aquatic and in these seepy or more moist conditions, because there's a stream effect on microclimate where you have cool, moist conditions coming out from these channels into uplands. And it's balanced by this sort of forest effect coming down. Within 50 feet of streams, you have more cool, moist conditions, and that's across the Northwest landscape in general. So here's how I characterize, I think these are different, almost different ecosystems at a tiny scale across this landscape. So we were interested in, well, how are the animals moving across the landscape? And this gets back a bit to what Matt was talking about at the beginning is we want to know how the movement patterns, and then we can consider what we might do for connectivity, knowing the natural dispersal of these animals. So we were also interested in that. We put cover boards out. We don't have the luxury of doing radio tracking or putting monitors on animals to see where they're going. But with Mark recapture and using artificial cover boards, we can do repeated sampling and not wreck the area, just lift up the cover boards and see who's there and were they there before, or did they move between cover boards? So we put these out, and we put these out at a couple sites so far to look at occurrences and distribution and movement patterns of these amphibians. And the way that we align them, we put them near streams and then away from streams to also look to see if there were gradients of movement patterns associated with the stream riparian corridor. This is a very busy slide, but if you look at the top left first, you'll see that there's a box and there's a stream at the bottom of the box. This is in a reference stand that was not thinned. We were doing a timber harvest experiment, but we have the boards near the stream and then in different distances from the stream. And in this unthinned stand, you can see a slight pattern that there's more animals and more movements of animals within 5 to 15 meters of the stream. And that is greatly, I was going to say exacerbated. That's not the right word, but it's magnified in the panel to the right, which is in a 70-meter riparian buffer, which is a one tree height buffer along the stream. So the stream's at the bottom of that right panel. And then you see the buffer boundary is delineated. And then above the buffer boundary is a thinning. So there was timber harvest, but there were some trees left. And you see the stream side area just being crazy with the number of animals, and they're moving between the 5 meter and the 14 meter cover boards. This has led to ideas that we feel that the stream side areas, and especially where you have buffers, it can end up being a concentration of animals in those cool, moist areas near the stream. And it's almost like the I-5 corridor that you build it and they will come and they will use these areas and move between them. And this is sort of concentrated habitat for dispersal, movement, and potentially connectivity. So the idea here is you have streams out on the landscape, and here you can see an area where the streams have been buffered with an upland thinning. And so the streams pop out as there's a diagonal that goes from the upper left to the lower right, where a large stream buffer has been put on a larger perennial stream. And then the intermittent streams have smaller buffers, and you can see them kind of going up to the right, up to the top and up to the right. The idea is that these riparian buffers can function as corridors across the landscape. They can extend and connect these stream side moist, cool corridors into the intact forest stands that may exist at their ends. They may function as funnels and chains to assist migration of animals across the landscape. So there's the idea. Is it actually happening? Well, let's go forward a bit. The Northwest Forest Plan put buffers all over the landscape, and there are 1 and 2 tree site potential tree height buffers, and that has put a lot of lines on the federal landscape since 1994 to present. But those lines show connectivity within watersheds, but not between watersheds. And that arrow, you can point to a place where you have a gap between the buffers. So buffers may have a really good function within networks of streams, but not between networks of streams. For connectivity, do we need to connect up and over ridgelines? And how would we do that? So here's another sort of schematic diagram of two parallel stream networks. How can we connect? Well, the light green shows riparian buffers offering that stream side protection and potentially corridor function. But how do you connect across landscapes? And here are just three examples that you could provide: down wood, larger logs, and live trees to provide habitat connectivity up and over those ridgelines to connect the corridors. In another schematic diagram, up at the top, you have stream buffers of different widths, A and B. C adds a headwater reserve. That was first conceptualized in a paper by John Sissel et al. In 1998 called the Augusta Creek Landscape Design, where headwater reserves were put for headwater associated amphibians. C and D show a couple designs of what you might be thinking about for headwater reserves: headwater reserving a single watershed or connecting between two different watersheds, parallel watersheds. D also shows an example of tributary junctions downstream, which are often at perennial stream connection points. And stream junctions like that are associated with higher biodiversity of a broad community of organisms, which could be mammals, amphibians, and a lot of different groups. So that's another sort of a biodiversity hotspot that may warrant protection. E below shows connectivity designs that might occur between distinct watersheds, watersheds that don't have aquatic connectivity between each other. And so you might have a headwater reserve and maybe a thinned area and some patch reserves, some skips and gaps up in that E and G area. The idea of watersheds not having aquatic connectivity between them is important for a couple of reasons. We've learned that downstream in the perennial sections of streams, the giant salamanders can be more common, and they get larger as they go down into larger streams. In some places. But as you go downstream, the fish distribution and the fish abundance and diversity increases. Fish are predators, and there is a predator-prey thing going on along that stream continuum. And the amphibians are nice little cookies for the fish. And so we think that there is a limit to the in-stream amphibians going down into the larger streams because of predation pressure, and that is essentially pushing them up into headwaters. So the corridors along the larger streams may be effective for the riparian or upland amphibians, but not so effective for the in-stream amphibians. So the connectivity in headwaters and up and over headwaters to discrete watersheds may be especially important for these amphibians. Connectivity considerations on the landscape. As we start to look at bigger spatial scales, there may already be protections on the larger landscape, and we can capitalize on those. And in the Oregon Coast Range, the Coast Range is a landslide-prone area. Landslides are one of the main disturbances of these forests, and it's associated with stream riparian areas. Set-asides in terms of riparian buffers are already out there for landslide-prone areas. And so we can capitalize on these and use those riparian buffers, riparian reserves put for landslides as sort of stepping off points for corridors, funnels, and chains for the amphibians as well. We've seen in some of Ray's maps the checkerboard landscape, and this is a challenge for connectivity. But how would you do connectivity in that sort of a landscape? And that the corners become everything at that point, between those stands that have greater retention of the forested habitat. But you need to overlay the riparian structure, the stream riparian network on it to really get a better view of how it might happen for amphibians. And so in panel B on the right, you have a close-up of a potential checkerboard landscape with streams on it. And to connect along the diagonals is a challenge, but connection with leaf islands, retained trees, downwood, you can promote that as being a corridor of moist, cool conditions, which are needed for those ground-dwelling amphibians. And you can imagine this sort of design could also be used with other types of reserves on the landscape, whether there is an upland owl core, for example, habitat maintained for owls, botanical set-asides, or other refugia that are already on the landscape. Use them for amphibians as well. Some of the basic tenets for providing landscape connectivity have been pointed out, and I think Matt was talking about some of these, but we don't want just one corridor. We want redundancy. We want sort of a not just one I-5 corridor connecting our landscapes. We would like to see multiple connections because these will hedge uncertainties with forest fire or other disturbances or catastrophes that might happen on the landscape that are somewhat unpredictable. And watersheds offer a template for redundancy. We have drainages that are highly dissected. And as you go into headwaters, these offer opportunities for providing that stream riparian connection up and over watersheds. Here's, I think this picture is from the Oregon Coast Range, maybe near Cummins Creek or Drift Creek. And you can just see all the headwaters transecting that landscape. There's lots of opportunities. There's been predictions or models of the Northwest stream networks, and 70 to 80% of stream length can be in these small streams, these headwaters. So there's ample opportunity for planning and implementing redundant connections if you think of the landscape as watersheds rather than just forest or no forest. So we did some modeling of the Oregon Coast Range in this light and cut it into, cookie cuttered into watersheds. And watersheds have different sizes, and they're called HUCs, H-U-C, Hydrologic Unit Code, or shorthand that I might be saying is fourth field or fifth, sixth field, seventh field basins. So a fourth HUC is a fourth field basin. And I've circled the Siuslaw Basin there, and we're going to zoom into it. So the Siuslaw is a fourth field HUC. And here it is. And then I've cookie cuttered the Siuslaw into sixth and seventh field basins. And you'll see one in the middle, it looks kind of like a duck. That's a sixth field. And within that sixth field, there are 3 seventh field watersheds. So now let's see, what if we were to consider connecting these watersheds to each other? And so in this slide, what we've done is connect every sixth field to one other sixth field with one connection. So if you look at the duck, it has one connection to each of its neighboring sixth fields. That's one link for every 9 square kilometers in the Sayusla River Basin. This is redundant connections. Do we need this many? Well, I don't know how many we need, but this provides an opportunity for some linkage. Now, maybe you can prioritize where these linkages might occur. One place is just to have an economy of space and action. Look for those places on the landscape where 3 watersheds come together at a point. And there are 12 of these in the Oregon Coast Range. I just call them triads because I needed a way to refer to them. It's where 3 distinct watersheds come together at a point, and the water within each of those watersheds flows separately to the Pacific Ocean. So that would be a place that you could design connectivity across 3 distinct watersheds. And that would be very important for landscape connectivity for amphibians or any of the organisms that may be funneled up to headwaters and have that headwater connection up and over to neighboring watersheds. Mary's Peak is an example of a triad. There are 3 watersheds that come together at Mary's Peak. The Yaquina River watershed, that water flows towards Newport, Oregon. The Alsea River watershed, the water flows down toward Yachats. And the Marys River watershed, which is part of the Columbia River, where water flows to Portland and then out the Columbia. So here are lots of opportunities for connections up and over ridgelines to connect between 3 distinct watersheds. But further, consider, where do you have least resistant links? Where are the slopes not a huge ridgeline, maybe with rock, cliff? And also, where do you have short distances? And so I don't know if you can see my arrow, but I'm pointing over toward a connection between the Alsea and the Yaquina, and you can see that there are some headwater tributaries that are pretty close to each other. These provide opportunities that you can think of as sort of economically important. Here's a place to do connections between neighboring watersheds. And then between the Alsea and the Marys River, there's similarly places that provide opportunities to connect between headwaters and the Alsea over here and the Marys River. Opportunities that you don't have to connect very far, but that provides some opportunity for within a small area to connect across 3 watersheds. So these are ideas. And how can we test these ideas? And I took out my slide, and I'm killing myself for doing that, but I'll just say what I took out. We tested this with genetics. So it's very difficult to do mark recapture. It's a lot of effort to do mark recapture with amphibians to see where they're moving. But genetics provides a way that you can look at connectivity across landscapes, landscape genetics. You can look at the genetic signature of animals in different places, or of any organism in different places, and see how connected they are, how similar the genetic variability is in different areas. And we did that in the Oregon Coast Range for the stream breeding torrent salamanders, which occur in headwaters at the uppermost intermittent stream section, and giant salamanders, which were down in more of the perennial streams. And we used Mary's Peak as one of our study sites, but we looked up and down the Coast Range at many study sites. And we found, so I'm just going to point to some nearby areas, that the genetic signature of torrent salamanders in the Yaquina and the Alsea and the Marys River were the same. Those animals were identically the same. The populations were connected. And same thing for the giant salamanders. So we have some proof of concept that the animals are moving between watersheds, and especially when we looked at these headwaters, they're moving across those headwaters. However, torrent salamanders showed a couple patterns as we did this this genetic study across the Coast Range landscape. They were more connected where we had forest cover in landscape, less connected where there was not forest cover. So we could look at landscape scale habitat features and associate those with the genetic variability and the genetic similarity of these animals. Forest cover was associated with the genetic similarity of the animals. Roads were negatively associated with genetic connectivity for torrent salamanders. So roads were a barrier. So now we have some insights to maintain forest cover, perhaps look for places that we have least resistant links to their habitat, close and not a challenge for them to be climbing between. They're very small animals. In fact, today, this morning before this started, I was looking at my email and I got a photo. It's like, DeDe, please identify the species. I'm sorry, it's only 15 millimeters long, so it was a tiny little salamander, but we can't figure out what species it is. It's like, well, 15 millimeters, there's an animal trying to go across the landscape. It's a challenge for connectivity. So those least resistant links become very important when you're trying to maintain connectivity for a terrestrial animal that is so tiny and its steps are so small. So for torrent salamanders, forest cover and roads seem to be important. For giant salamanders, we did not analyze it in the same way, but a key result that we found for giant salamanders is that 1 in 5 populations that we analyzed had a genetic bottleneck. That means it had low genetic variation. We looked at the landscape to see if that correlated with timber harvest or past forest fire or agricultural development or anything that we might be able to pull out of that landscape from past map data that was available. And we could not find a correlation with it. The only thing that is a hypothesis at this point, but might explain 1 in 5 giant salamander populations having a bottleneck would be landslide prone areas with frequent landslides occurring in 1 in 5 areas over an evolutionary time frame of these animals. So we don't know for sure if that's happening, but that is our hypothesis right now, that landslides might be important. The bottom line is, because 1 in 5 giant salamander populations has a bottleneck, we need redundant connectivities because we may not know where those bottlenecks are occurring. And so there may be some natural processes going on with these animals that warrant not a single connection, but redundant connections. So going on with implementation considerations for connectivity for these animals at landscape scales. When we think of climate change, very broadly, north-south connections, east-west connections, inland, coastal for the Coast Range in particular, also looking at where there may be climate refugia for amphibians. Oftentimes those are in hill-shaded areas, which may be north-facing slopes, cool, moist areas. Or if you have a model like Ray was showing of fire refugia, which hopefully those maps will be out in the next few years, shelters from where we think hot, dry, windy spots have fire ignitions. I saw in some of those maps that near the Pacific Ocean, those were refugia. The closer you were to the Pacific Ocean, the fewer wildfire and climate refugia were occurring. So that gives you a hint that, you know, the ocean itself is providing that cool, moist sort of ocean effect, just like a stream effect is happening in streams. And if you have maps of where people are, put these links away from people. That's another consideration. So there's one example of how to pull all this together, and it's from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, the Wind River watershed. And they were planning broad-scale thinning in the Wind River. And what their wildlife biologist, Neil Chartier, contacted me and said, DeDe, let's put out your linkage area design, and we'll start to see if we can test it. And so this is one example of a landscape design that has been put together with some of these concepts. And I'll go through some of the symbols. There's a lot of symbols. This was first designed for the Middle Wind River harvest that they were planning a few years ago. So the blue dots on this map show where you have different watersheds adjoining neighboring watersheds. So those are areas that might be considered for over-ridge connectivity links. But more importantly, the diamonds are where you have triads, where three distinct watersheds are coming together, and the water from each of those is flowing separately out into different directions. And so those, I would capitalize on those first, the blue diamonds, and see where you might be able to put redundant links across those different watersheds. Those are the triads. Let's see, the two yellow arrows close together are areas on this landscape that we decided could be least resistant links because they were somewhat swales. They were ridge lines, but they weren't, you know, mountain peaks, so to speak. They were areas that we envisioned salamanders being able to walk up and over. And so those areas, there's a few of those on the landscape. And then lastly, the one I'm going to point out are the brown hexagons, and those were owl habitats. And so those are upland areas that were going to be maintained in trajectories toward late successional old growth habitat for owls. And so those are little refugia within watersheds that can embolden the amphibian habitat as well. They are also associated with LSOG conditions. So here's just an example of how you might consider putting these concepts out at a landscape scale. So in summary, I've gone through some considerations for amphibian connectivity designs, thinking that these animals can be funneled up and over landscapes using riparian corridors and refugia habitats. So some of the basic considerations: use existing set-asides, expand and connect those. See if you can adapt your funnels and chains to land ownership patterns. Redundant connections. And to do that, think of watersheds and how you might redundantly connect across watersheds at landscape scales. Link discrete watersheds in particular, and I call those triads, because there's no freshwater connectivity between those triads. Least resistant links might have short distances between them, or be less topographically challenging for a salamander to walk up and over, or a frog. And then consider the biogeography of species, climate change, and fire refugia. So that's that futurescape that Ray was talking about. And we don't have those maps available quite yet, but they're going to become more and more available to you as time goes on. The climate niche futures for amphibians have not been mapped for the Coast Range yet, but 2 weeks ago, the climate future maps of reptiles came out, and I'll share one with you. So I was on this paper that looked at the climate niche futures for lizards and snakes in Western North America. Lizards and snakes are highly associated with climate, just like amphibians are, except that many of the snakes and lizards need different types of climate, microclimate, and are adapted to warmer areas as well. We mapped the climate niche of all of 130 animals species in Western North America, looking at the climate niche of where their past habitat has been from historical records, and especially records that were put together in the last 20, 30 years. So we use that as current habitat. And then we did climate futures of how that climate niche was predicted to change with different climate scenarios and different timeframes. This map is showing the turn of the next century with the most severe climate model, 85, RCP 85, for one species, the rubber boa. So the map shows 3 colors. Yellow and gray are the past habitat, the current historical habitat of the rubber boa, yellow and gray together. The yellow is predicted to be lost by the turn of the century with the RCP 85 scenario. Gray is maintained into the next century. Blue is predicted climate niche that is gained in the next century. So I just want you to look at the Oregon Coast Range here. And this is a species that occurs here now. You can see the yellow and gray together. It occurs a lot of places in Oregon. But the climate future modeled here shows the Oregon Coast Range and some of the Cascade Range as anchor habitat into the future. So this is an example of a looking at climate refugia, that anchor habitat that can float these organisms into the future with predictions for climate, and fire is related to this. But the Coast Range figures very prominently for many species into the future. And you can see that signature. I'm reminded of Ray's maps of showing the Coast Range and that ocean influence on microclimate there. And it is going to be important. That whole strip along the Oregon coast is tomorrow's reserve for a lot of species. And so I just leave you with this thought that what you're managing today is going to be a future biodiversity hotspot for a lot of organisms tomorrow. And with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, DeDe, for that fantastic presentation, and to all of our presenters for that great information that they put together. We'll open up for a Q&A period. So feel free to either put your questions in the chat or come off of mute to say them. I will go ahead and start us off with a question that Fran put in the chat during the presentations to Ray in particular. What does it mean to think about fires advancing on the wet coastal areas? What are the management actions that can be taken to try to retain these forests and fire refugia?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Fran. I find myself thinking about climate change a lot lately. And in relationship to the historical forests that we're used to, and then what the science indicates those forests might look like into the future as a result of disturbances. And fire is a big shaper of our forests here in the Pacific Northwest, whether it shapes it very infrequently but big, like those old burnt forest maps I showed you at the beginning of my presentation. So in the Coast Range, fires happened. They were very infrequent in between the fires, but when they happened, they were big, and they turned a lot of old forest into very young forest. And then those young forests slowly grew back up into old forest through time. So that's kind of how it worked. And for species that can move around really quickly, have wings, that's not a big problem. But for red tree voles, I think the reason the distinct population segment is in the Coast Range is because it takes a long time for them to move back from a surviving patch of old forest into that old big burnt area as it recovers and turns back into old forest. So that's how it worked. And so all that fuel's been developing. You saw how things are growing back in my time series, just 25 years of change. Things are still growing back. And the Siuslaw has not experienced one of those big fires for a long time. So I think if we trust the history, eventually there's going to be another big fire. And it's probably going to do what it did historically and take out big chunks of forest. Now we have a highly fragmented remaining forest, if you remember that red tree vole map I showed you. So when the landscape is in that condition, it doesn't take more than one big fire to really impact a population. So I don't know, I'm sort of maybe rambling on here, but to me, when this next big fire is going to happen in the Coast Range, I don't know. I think the odds each year increase that as things warm up and dry up, that the odds of an ignition are going to turn into a big fire, and mostly they're associated with east wind events and dry conditions. The odds of an ignition turning into a big fire that's going to cause huge changes to the Coast Range, I think it's just increases. It's increasing with time. So what do we do to prepare for it? I don't know what the answer to that is. I do think some of the science we're producing is aimed at helping find those answers. So those fire refugia maps. Right now, most of the Coast Range, as DeDe mentioned, is a fire refugia. By the end of the century, topography is going to matter a lot more to where fire refugia is in the Coast Range. So I think if we have some sort of periscope that we can look in, how things might look in the future, we might want to start managing accordingly before those big fires happen. I think what we normally do is we don't act on this stuff until something actually happens, and it sort of forces us to do that. But I think I'm hoping we start paying attention to the science, the climate change science, and thinking about, having not having a failure of imagination. I'll use an example with the barred owl. So I monitor I work for a program that monitors barred owl populations. They are actually pushing the northern spotted owl into extinction. We knew the barred owls were entering their range back in the 1970s. And it wasn't until like the early 2000s that we realized, oh, wow, this is a big problem for the persistence of northern spotted owls. We had a failure of imagination on the ramifications of something that we'd been monitoring and we saw coming. I'm hoping that we don't do the same thing with climate change. We know it's coming. We have some information about how things might change. Let's not have a failure of imagination.
I'll just add in a little bit. I think of space and time, sort of this continuum. When I look at California and where the amphibians occur on that landscape, climate change has already happened for some of those, and amphibians are occurring in the dark side of the forest where you have hill shading, and in those riparian corridors. So we have already established fire management recommendations in places like the Siskiyou National Forest on the border of Oregon and California. Then the hilltops and along roads where you have people's property, which are priorities for protection, and the refugia for animals are away from those areas. So in the stream corridors and on the hill shaded areas in particular, and use those as your points, the funnels where connectivity might might come out from those areas. So we have some designs already for fire management that could be translated to areas like the Coast Range, where maybe on the west or the east slopes of the Coast Range, we might have more fire starts, or where people are located and roads.
Great, thank you for that. And I
Thank you
saw
both.
Chandra's
Mhm.
hand. And then we'll do Paul.
Sorry, did you say my name?
Yeah,
A truck went
yeah,
by.
we'll do Chandra and then
Thank
we'll
you.
go to Paul's question.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for those presentations. And I guess trying to connect some dots in my head here. I completely understand and I really appreciated Matt's points about, connectivity and fragmentation effects being really species specific. And so then I really appreciated hearing, more about, spotted owls and amphibians and what they might need or how they might be impacted. But I think my question, and, I don't know if this is, framed up in like a, how do we manage the landscape way or not, but how can we take this information that's very species specific, like connecting, the headwaters in certain ways for to benefit amphibians, for example, to have the maximum benefit for the most species, I know that spotted owl habitat and managing, spotted owl habitat or for spotted owls was kind of seen as like an umbrella management species in many ways because, they're if you protect their habitat and, connections to reduce fragmentation, you're benefiting, marble murrelet habitat also. But how can we take some of these lessons and especially in the face of climate change, apply them in ways that can have the maximum benefit for even more species? Yeah. Any ideas? Welcome, because I think that's what we're going to end up having to deal with.
So we have the threatened and endangered species, and those have highest priority for maintenance right now. So I think you put those patches on the landscape first and look at those to see where there are opportunities for others.
I'll just add to that. I think we're used to, as managers, managing, well, you probably heard this term, within a historical natural range of variation. And if things aren't changing from what they were historically, it makes a lot of good sense. And I'm thinking, we should be maybe focusing on future, conditions, like what's normal in the Roseburg Umpqua Valley area is probably going to be normal for the lower Willamette Valley by mid-century in terms of climate. And so what are those forests and how do things connect and function down there? And think about that when we're managing up here in this area. Try to get ahead of the curve, basically. Being cautious in the process, but and then thinking holistically, not just thinking northern spotted owls, and actually edges and the fire-prone portions of the spotted owls range, a continuous territory just covered with old forest is not as good as a forest that's a mosaic of younger forests and older forests. So edges down there are not negative, and maybe in the future, they won't be as negative up here in the northern portions of the range. But doing it cautiously. The science is not perfect. So that's why I think it's important to monitor in the program I work in, to keep seeing if our management is actually pushing things in the direction we want to see it or not.
Even the west slope of the Coast Range, using that, the Pacific coast, the Pacific Ocean side is a huge refuge for climate. And that may be where you put your efforts for connectivity, for long-term connectivity. Matt needs to talk.
Yeah, I'd love to add a few things. I mean, the idea of really trying to focus on conserving these refugia is very important. We've made a lot of hay out of some work out of the H.J. Andrews LTER that shows that old growth forests tend to be quite a lot cooler than even old plantations. And 2.5 degrees C is a lot. So if you can maintain those forests, you're doing a great job of holding things within the thermal niches of species like DeDe was talking about. The problem is that our disturbance regime is shifting, as Ray's indicated. And we were all cocky about our refugia at the Andrews until last August when the Lookout fire started. And guess what? Where we predicted refugia to be was not where refugia were. And so there is uncertainty around that, and you can't rest on the laurels of old growth is going to save it all, unfortunately. So there's more to be learned there. I mean, I do think overall, in theory, old growth should be more resistant to fire than younger plantations. That may not have held up at the Andrews in particular, just because of the nature of the fire, but there's some work from across Southern Oregon showing that is the case. And so one important question to raise too, especially in the face of the Northwest Forest Plan revision, is to what extent we deliberately try and protect old growth from stand replacing fire at least. So I know this was on the table for discussion. Should we be actively managing old growth to try and climate proof it? I think generally it was agreed that should not be the case. And then should we be trying to do fire suppression around old growth because we have so little of it left and we know it could function as a climate refugia? And that part, I think, was not agreed upon and fell out of that revision, but you'll learn more about that over the coming weeks. So, and I honestly, I'm a little bit ambivalent. I don't know, because we don't know a lot about the historical range of variation and the way fire behaved in the Coast Range and the Cascades. It's hard to make a firm management recommendation right now. I will say that Andrew Marshall is finding that fires seem more prevalent, low severity fires in the Coast Range than I thought, at least. I pictured it to be this incredibly moist, fire resistant landscape. He's finding fire scars, every 50 years or less in some of these old growth stands in the Coast Range. And then that's also being shown by James Johnson and others in the Oak Ridge watershed. But I really want to do this for the Andrews because I think it could behave pretty differently. I'd be surprised if fire was deeply embedded in the system at higher frequency in that part of the Cascades near Blue River. Anyway, that's a long rambling explanation. Oh, I wanted to add one more thing. Umbrella species. We're kind of running out of umbrella species. Spotted owl isn't doing that great, as Ray was indicating. And I think you often hear, why do we conserve old growth? Well, because it has untold biodiversity. And the question we've been asking lately is, why is it still untold? There are all these cryptic species that live in old growth forest. We don't really know much about them. We don't know which ones are more old growth obligates. And I do think we need to make a push for finding out more about the distribution and abundance of those species. Because, yeah, we've been relying on owl as an indicator and an umbrella, but I'm not sure we can for much longer. And it's going to be important to know what we stand to lose if those old growth patches do burn over in the future.
I'll just add a practicality clause to fire management. We don't have enough fire resources, people, property, money to manage fire conditions when it's happening or before it happens everywhere. And so what we saw this year, for example, fires being let loose and not being managed very much unless there were people and property at risk. That means private property. So fires were being managed when they were close to private property and not being managed elsewhere. There's a couple exceptions. I saw this year that the H.J. Andrews that Matt was talking about, an experimental forest, they did a hard stop of the fire, the new fire, the ore fire north of the Andrews this year, and did not let it go to that experimental forest. And it, but then they let it go to the north, which was federal lands. So if that continues and we have prioritization of where fire management is occurring, and if old growth is not a priority for fire managers, then we're left with what is left. So That's a decision I think that people and the politicians and et cetera will be dealing with, because we can't manage fire everywhere given the extent of fires that we've had recently.
Hey, Danny, I know we're at the bottom of the top of the hour, but I just want to add one more piece of information for folks to chew on. And, you know, timber harvesting changes the forest, but fire also changes the forest too. And lack of fire changes the forest. So we have the monitoring program, the forests that we are tracking as mature and old growth forests. Some of those meet the definition because of a century of fire exclusion, mostly in the fire prone areas, the east side and Klamath, portions of the Spotted Owls Range, but maybe a little bit in the Coast Range, as Andrew Marshall started to find out. So just because it's old growth today, maybe it's there because of a century or more fire exclusion. Not old growth. I'm going to talk more to mature forest. I think if it's old growth there today, it was probably old growth back in the day. But I think this is more of an issue for our mature forest. Some of those might be in that condition, or the wrong type of mature forest. Say wants to be ponderosa pine type forest, but now it's mixed conifer type forest. That's because we've kept fire out of the system. So anyway, it's complicated.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for those answers. We are at our time, but we had a question from Paul. Would folks be able to stay on to answer that question, and then we can wrap up?
Yep.
Great. And for those of you who need to leave at this time, thanks for being on, and we're going to do a write-up of these questions so you can see the answer later as well. So yeah, I'll pass it to you, Paul E. Oh, we can't hear you.
Where Paul can type it out.
Yeah, if you'd be able to type your question in the chat, that'd be great.
Still can't hear you, Paul. Can you put it in the chat?
I don't know sign language well enough.
Yeah, we still can't hear you, but if you could type your question in the chat.
Or if you email it, then
Or
we can answer it later. We're all dogged with technical failures. While he's doing that, another quick question maybe? Oh yeah, he says go to another person.
Yeah, any questions before we all sign off? Great. Well, in that case, thank you so much to our presenters for all the information and for your time today and leading up to this meeting, and to all of the folks that were able to join us today. So we really appreciate being able to put on this panel. And yeah, thanks all.
Thanks, Denny, for organizing.
Yeah, thank you, Danny.
Thanks, DeDe and Ray.
And yeah, hey, Matt, before you go, I just have to share, it was like a week ago, I got an email from Pers Sjogren, who was